Well, first of all, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express News' live event, looking at the Texas legislature and what's happened so far this year and what's still to come. And there's a lot on both of those fronts already. If you have questions, I want to start this right off here. Like, if you have questions, use the Q&A section of the chat on the Zoom to kind of get your questions in there. We'll kind of look at that and get into as many of those questions as we can as we get towards the end of the program. Uh, you know, Also, I have to say thanks to the San Antonio Express News for letting us use their studio here in the historic San Antonio Light Building. And finally, thankfully, I don't have to do all this by myself today. Of course, I'm Jeremy Wallace at the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express News. I do the political reporting. I'm also the co-host of the Texas Take podcast. And if you see my daily newsletter, the Texas Take newsletter with Jeremy Wallace, uh, I break down the news every day in there and also have a stock market report on politics. You definitely want to check that out. But all that aside, today, we're going to get into the legislature, and I have two people who are going to help me get through this that are going to be perfect for this program. First of all, make sure I get my notes here. Make sure I get everybody's introduction right here. First, Representative Steve Allison is with us. He was 12 years on the Alamo Heights School Board, if I remember correctly, and you were the president for a stretch there as well.
It was.
And he ended up as a three-term member of the Texas House. He worked on a lot of these issues on education, on property taxes. He knows what it looks like inside the Capitol, and certainly appreciate you being on the program to help us out.
Oh, thank you for including.
Kristian Carranza, she is a seasoned community activist in, certainly in Democratic politics for sure. You've seen her, working with you were a regional director with the Democratic National Committee, if I remember correctly. Worked on a lot of campaigns for the years, and she ran for House District 118, so she knows what it's like to get into the legislative issues and kind of dig into them from a Democratic perspective. So thanks a lot for joining me on all this. We got a lot to unpack, and so we're going to try to move through this as smoothly as we can. Thanks to everybody in the audience who joined us. I know it's a Thursday afternoon and you're spending your afternoon with us. We're going to make this as fun as we possibly can. So let's get straight into it. You can't talk about the Texas legislature this time around without talking about school choice or school vouchers, whatever you want to call them, depending where you are in your political spectrum. This is the issue of the legislative session. Governor Abbott has made clear he wants a bill through. What that looks like is anybody's guess. And let me just quickly update. So we know the Texas Senate has already passed their proposal, their first shot at this. Their proposal has $10,000 per parent for students to take their kids to potentially a private school, use it for that. I called it a coupon at times because it certainly doesn't cover the full cost of some private schools, but the intention is for it to cover using tax dollars to go to a private school. The House just unveiled their program just this last week that does something similar. It doesn't have the set dollar amount of 10,000 per student. Instead, they've tried to tie a percentage, and I think it's an 85 percentage number based upon whatever the funding formulas have structured out.
Basic allotment, yeah.
Yeah, so you're going to have like a different number. Like, some places might get up to 10,000. In other places, it's not going. It's going to be based on where you are and where you live. So these programs, that's a small detail, but it's a big detail at the same time. And so we, certainly, I would encourage everybody to check out, the coverage that we've been having at the Express News and the Houston Chronicle. Isaac Yu and Edward McKinley have been covering this issue really well. You want to tune into their coverage. But first, let's get into this. And I want to start with you, Representative Allison, because you have that experience of being in the middle of this fight, obviously. We had all those special sessions in the last time around, and a voucher program did not get through, obviously. Do you think this year, there's enough support in the Texas House for something like this to actually happen this time? Do you think this is going to finally make it, or is Governor Abbott assuming, look, he thinks he's going to get this time around, but I'm wondering, is it going to happen? It's I know there's a lot of agreement on it right now, but what do you think?
I think it's still an open question. I know that yesterday, there was released a list of a number of co-authors for
Yeah.
now that would indicate that he has the votes on that issue. You know, what I think that we have to keep in mind, though, that I think is so important is the funding aspect, school funding. That's where it fell apart last session. You know, when we went into the uh, 88th session, I certainly believed, and I think there was a clear consensus that we were going to do something for public education. The money was there. The need is there, to say the least. You know, the districts around the state are going into deficit budgets.
Yeah.
Just this morning, there was an article in the Express News about Northside is in horrible shape. Uh, Camps are closing. One of the districts in the district that I represent in Northeast is closing campuses. That's happening around the state, around the area. So we've got to deal with funding. Unfortunately, last session, the governor coupled it. And unless there was a voucher bill passed, he wouldn't agree to anything funding-wise, which is really unfortunate and short-sighted. So we're in that same predicament. And I'm hopeful that the members will really look at their districts and listen to their constituents and look what's really necessary for public education and education in general. And if they do that, I don't think that vouchers are going to make it. And I hope that's the case. You know, he calls it, the governor tries to call it school choice. And I think that's been done intentionally, and it's very deceptive. Because if you look at if you look at the definition of voucher in any dictionary, uh, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what exactly what he's trying to do. You know, and I don't think anyone is opposed to choice. Uh, and he tried to initially, and I think they still try to bank it a lot on 2 years ago, 4 years, whenever the Republican primary, there was a series of proposals, and one of them was school choice. Uh, I don't remember even voting on that, but the way I understand it was worded, I probably would have voted for it.
Yeah.
Who's not in favor of choice? And, you know, and we've got a track record of supporting that. Here in most urban areas, but just concentrate here that I was focused on, we have an abundance of choice opportunity. Schools. I think we react tremendously well to the whims and requests of students and parents, different areas, like in one of the districts I represent, where I served on the school board, Alamo Heights. There was an interest in rocketry.
Yeah.
There's an interest in culinary arts that has really grown, an interest in business incubator program. You know, and that not a traditional curriculum. The governor tries to describe our public education system as a one size fits all, and nothing could be further from the truth. And if he would bother to visit a public school rather than just a private school, he might see that.
Well, it's important to know he was just in San Antonio at
And
San Antonio Christian School. Again, the tuition up there is about 16 to 17,000, I think, for the high school. So clearly the $10,000 wouldn't make it. And it's really important to point out, like, the one of the other big, differences in these two bills is how they address who's going to get to use an ESA. They're called educational savings accounts, and that's what that's Abbott's using that for the phrasing on it. Very similar to what we've seen in other states. Iowa and Arizona both have programs called ESAs as
Yeah.
well. And the way the program would work for, I'm trying to think, in the Senate, they want to, that $10,000, once everybody takes that money from it, like if they run out of slots, they're going to have priority for people who need special education needs and things like that. The House plan is trying to be a little bit more focused on the front end, saying, look, we're going to first dibs on ESAs will go to, special needs kids and for, parents under a certain level of income. And so they're trying to gear it to lower people, lower income, not super low, but lower income. And so you can see both chambers are trying to do something a little bit different, which gets you to that question of, like, okay, so there's some serious differences in this, these programs and how they play out. Let me ask you about this, Kristian. Is there any way that the program could do what Abbott wants it to do, at least what he said, which is helping people who may be in a school that they don't think is right for the kid, who may not have the means to go to a private school, will this really like allow a kid on the South Side to go to a San Antonio Christian school, or something like that? Is
Yeah.
that realistic?
I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I've been watching what's been happening over the last 7 weeks, and my perspective comes from my community where we have a lot of issues. San Antonio right now is the epicenter for school closures, and it is happening on the south side. Harlandale ISD, where I went to school, we lost 4 elementary schools last school year. I mean, it's the whole reason I even ran for office. And just like Rep. Allison mentioned earlier, NEISD, Northeast ISD, it's one of the more affluent school districts we have in the county. They're also closing schools. Overall, throughout the whole county, in the last 3 years, we have closed 27 schools. Either they're closed now or they're about to close. That's shameful. The reason that's happening is because schools have been chronically underfunded for decades here in Texas. And so what we have to do is make sure that we're funding our schools first. The the plans that they have put forward don't have an income cap, right? So, I mean, really who it's going to benefit, these vouchers are going to be parents who can already afford to send their children to private schools. I mean, if you're looking at the San Antonio as a whole, I mean, it's 78% Mexican American. 18% of the people that live in San Antonio fall below the poverty line. The national average is about 11%. So these are very working class communities. And I was knocking doors all throughout my campaign. I knocked, I think, over 10,000 doors. And you see a lot of the same type of family dynamics in my neighborhood. It's like mom has one job, dad has two jobs. They have 2 kids. They need to get to school by 7 a.m. They need hot breakfast, hot lunch. They need to get childcare till 6 p.m. And are you telling me that you think that this family is going to be able to, with the $10,000 voucher, with the voucher, be able to find a private school that is close to them where they're going to be able to get all those services? I mean, I would say not very likely.
Well, and to onto that point, like for the Houston audience, like the way it's kind of almost pitched is that like some kid in South Houston is going to be able to send their kid to St. John, private school, which costs $50,000 a year to go to, and it's about 25 miles away from you.
Yeah.
It's like the question is like the voucher is going to have to cover both the tuition and the transportation cost and kind of get those students there. So it's one thing to have that choice, but how do you get that student there? And there are some schools where that'll work. It's like, I was looking down in Laredo, and there's some private schools there where the tuition is like, $3,500. So then you can, okay, now I can figure out how the transportation would help me get my kid there as well. But it's not like kids are suddenly in poor school districts are automatically going to be able to get into a private school. We know that private schools can pick what they want, in the students. So, and that's one thing I was trying to get clarification on, like, and, I apologize if I don't have this nailed down yet, but like you have to get approved for that private school still. If you're getting that ESA too, so you're going to have to know, it's like, I'm going to apply for this ESA to apply for a school that I may not get into. Then what do we do? And I want to,
Well, and that's part of the problem. It's really a misnomer to call it school choice because it's not parent choice or school choice. It's the school's choice. The private school decides who they're going to pick, who they're going to keep. We had an experiment, for lack of a better description, here years back. I don't recall it when it happened, but we tried to piece it back together. Edgewood was performing very poorly. And so there was a private effort to create a voucher program. They're privately funded, worked well for the first year or two. And then the kids started going back either by the school's choice, and it was a number of pop-up schools. It's one of the inherent problems with creating a program like this. There aren't the existing schools to serve all these kids that might want to go there if they do. But in any event, the Edgewood thing failed, for lack of a description. It's not operational anymore. And what I understand is when those kids went back to Edgewood, they went back behind. That's the worst thing that can happen. And I think what we need to look at is, I certainly looked at it when I was in the legislature, that you need to look at other states' experiments and experience with these programs. And without exception, the kids that take the vouchers were in private school.
Yeah.
It's a high percentage, from high 60s up to the one state is 90-some%. But the average is right about 75%. So what have you accomplished? If that's all you're doing, you're just subsidizing. And what troubles me with the Senate bill is based on 500% of poverty level,
Yep.
which isn't reaching the ones you'd think would really want to help.
Yeah.
The House bill is a little bit different. It split it.
Yep.
I think it's 200% for one category and then 500% for, I think it's 200% for the disabled and 500% for lower income.
And
I don't know any family making $164,000.
Yeah.
That's like two parents and two, like, I don't know anyone like that.
Well, and remember, like when Rick Perry and George W. Bush kind of pushed, their own school voucher program, they were geared and targeted to low income families that were in schools that were considered failing, and they were very targeted type pilot projects. That's not what's happening now. This is much more of a universal push. Abbott, after this last 2023 cycle, decided he wants it full universal now. He doesn't want like even a token program that like can test it out first. He wants to go full board. And I wanted something you were talking about with funding of public schools, right? It's like that's one of the key components. The House is trying to make sure that there's a package that includes an increase in the basic allotment, right? And we know from the last time there was a much higher basic allotment proposal that didn't get through because it got blown up by the governor.
It wasn't much higher, but I know the hope was House Bill 1 in the fourth special session had a combination, had the voucher provision that a number of us voted to strike. The rest of the bill was workable. And I think a lot of us envisioned that we'd work with that, amend it. The basic allotment was up some, but not near where it needed to go. There wasn't enough funding in it, but that could have been addressed through amendments and discussion of the rest of the bill. And if the governor insists on dealing with vouchers separately, so be it. But we need to separate the funding need that is so vitally important. And we weren't able to do that, and we still aren't. The basic allotment hasn't been raised since 2019. Since 2019, we've gone through COVID. We've gone through a horrible inflation, and we're not keeping up. The House bill, the current one, wants to increase the basic allotment by $220. That's woefully inadequate.
That's not much.
I worked on a bill last session, worked with the comptroller's office unsuccessfully because it got so expensive. But I think to get back to the 2019 levels, plus get to address inflation, and the COVID impact, we'd need to get it up to about $7,800 from the $6,100 is right now. Very expensive, very necessary. But to go up $200, it's almost an insult. And then when you couple it further, one thing we also need to deal with, and we wanted to last session, is teacher and staff compensation.
Right.
Exactly. We've got to get that up.
Right.
Well, in I know my first session, and I did a good deal of work on it. We passed House Bill 3, which I think was really transformational and a very progressive and important education reform bill. Within that, there's any increase in the basic allotment. There's a little bit of a tie to there has to be a percentage of 30% of 80% to compensation, teacher compensation. In the current House bill, they've increased that to 40%. So of that $220, 40% would go to teacher compensation, which is certainly necessary. But the Senate bill treats that separately, which I think is important. So of that $220, only 60% is going to go into the classroom. Where it's so needed.
Well, and if y'all see the Texas newsletter from a couple of weeks ago, I had Senator Brandon Creighton, who was trying to manage, both these bills at the same time in the Senate. He told me like his intention was always to keep those bills separate. Of course, that's not what happened in 2023. They ended up getting jammed together. And so they had to kind of push that through. And he told me like his incentive, this time around, he still envisions that's the way he wants to keep them separate. Now, truth be told, time will tell us what ends up happening. The legislative process, like, just so folks watching, it's like just because the House passed a version and the Senate passed a version, they still have to come to one specific bill that goes through. So there's going to be a long negotiation process between the House and the Senate that will end up with something what we call a conference committee, where they will kind of ultimately try to have to hammer something out that the governor would theoretically then have to want to approve, right? And so all those things are happening. They're not going to reach a deal that the governor's just going to veto. That's not in anybody's interest. So they're going to try to figure out, how do we find common ground? And that is a big thing, right? Just because you have the basic, coming right out the gate, everybody agreeing on some concepts, it's a long way from a bill passing, in spite of some of the pro voucher comments
Well,
being
and they're
made.
separate, and I think they're going to stay separate.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're going to be dealt with separately. But at the same time, I think they have to be dealt with together, because uh, I don't see either one of them being successful unless there's kind of a package. We've got to deal with the funding issue.
Well, when Kristian, when you were talking about the schools, like, it's like Houston's feeling that too. That we just had a story about how, like, there was a 4% enrollment drop at Houston ISD. They're already under a lot of pressure. Cypress Independent School District was having major budget problems, worried about how they're going to make ends meet, and a lot of it ties back to that funding package from 2 years ago, that they didn't get. It's like everybody thought there was going to be more money coming, and it's put a lot of school districts in a bad spot. And so it's not just San Antonio, it's not just Houston, it's statewide. We're hearing, complaints in Lubbock and out in West Texas, like a lot of places trying to deal with this new environment we're in. All right. We could go on forever on the vouchers issue, but I want to switch over to a couple other issues here. First, let's get into the issue of abortion. Look, the Dobbs decision a couple years ago set the stage for Texas to pass an abortion ban, including having no exceptions for rape and incest. But within that, they did have one exception for the life of a mother, but that has clearly been complicated. A lot of mothers have had to leave the state, or have had doctors have refused to have the procedure done, out of fear that they could be sued over it. So it's created a lot of question, and it got to the point where Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick released and said he was willing to consider changes to the law to maybe adjust it. And so, Mike, I want to talk to you about this first, Christiana, about the what's been the impact of this law on the ground? Like, I know Democrats campaigned on this issue a lot in 2024. It wasn't always successful, right? And so the question is, was that a sign that voters, aren't on board with this issue yet, or is it just like complicated? Explain to me what this issue is right now, and what's it going to take for voters to actually start voting for Democrats on the issue, if it really is a big issue.
Well, Jeremy, I have to ask, can't we all agree that Texas is a dangerous place for women to be pregnant? 51% of the population in Texas are women. We have the worst maternal death rates, one of the worst maternal death rates in the whole country. I'm a woman of reproductive age, and it's scary times for us. We don't feel like this is a healthy environment, a welcoming environment for people to want to expand their families. Birth rates right now are also declining in Texas because people aren't going to want to have children. And that's also, we don't have as much kids in our public schools because not as many people are having their babies. So it's all connected,
Yeah.
right? And it's just making sure that we're having our elected officials answering these questions for us. Because, again, women like me, women that are planning to have children, we need answers. How close do you have to be to death's door to get basic medical care? Really, what are the boundaries? 2 hours to dying, 24 hours to dying? We really want to know. And I don't think that this is like inherently a partisan issue. I think that this is a health and safety issue. I think it's a generational issue. Grandmothers want to know for their mothers and for their daughters. We got to find some answers. I know that I've heard recently, Dan Patrick, and other Republicans kind of mention some concern about wanting to clarify the language. Well, we got to see action. Talk is cheap in Texas. We need priority. We need leadership. When I debated my state rep, John Lujan, when I debated him last year, he told a room of it was a standing room only audience. He said that he would commit to expanding exceptions for rape and incest. I mean, Mr. Lujan, I'm still waiting for your bill. Um, the other bills that I've seen that have been filed are from Representative Donna Howard, who is a known champion
Yep.
for women's issues and women's health care. So her bills want to clarify the language. They also want to expand the scope of different medical exceptions, like for health care for women who experience, who have a history of severe mental health issues. So those what often happens, right, is these bills, they get stuck in calendars, they get clogged up in calendars. We need urgency. We need people pushing those through right now. So if there are Republicans who say that they care about women and they care about the safety of women, then they need to push those bills through.
Well, and let me add, so I did have a conversation with the governor in the mansion a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him about this after what Dan Patrick had said, and he told me that he's not so sure that they need to clarify the law. He says, doctors aren't understanding what, the law already says, and he thought there was enough protections in the current law. That said, like Representative Allison, I think you can help kind of answer this question for me. Is like, when I think about Texas, I'm going to steal this from my Texas Take co-host Scott Braddock. He always says it's a primary state first. It's like, and a lot of Republicans are worried about their primary first and foremost. And I was thinking, even if Dan Patrick's willing to consider like making changes to the exception, who's going to carry that bill? Because I was thinking like any Republican who puts their name on something like that, puts himself at risk of, maybe unfairly being criticized as being weak on abortion just by clarifying the language. It feels like it's a dangerous topic for Republicans to weigh on, particularly if they are pro-life and they just want to clean up the exception.
Well, but I don't think that it violates any pro-life position. I consider myself very pro-life. I believe in the sanctity of life and the right to protect life at all stages. And I believe it was Donna Howard's bill that we passed 2 sessions ago that attempted to clarify the confusion. It obviously didn't well enough when we saw from the Cox situation.
Yep.
And then the second one, whose name I've forgotten already.
Zurofsky.
But I think that clearly shows that it's not clear. Yeah, maybe the doctors are misinterpreting it, but I disagree with the governor. I think by the doctors' actions or inactions and the medical board's inaction clearly shows we need to do some more tweaking or fixing of that situation and make sure that we protect mothers as well, and protect women. It's not just, we focus so much on the unborn, but it's much broader than that. And I think there's Republican support for that. We passed Donna's bill.
Yeah.
That attempted to improve the situation. And I think we need that to do that again. And I think there's
So if she passes her bill again, like in Dan Patrick signaling he's okay with the possibility, there's that. But I'm getting a sense that you're not hearing much at this point that gives you a lot of confidence in it.
I think it may have to come from the House.
Yeah.
Rather than try to originate in the Senate like most do. I heard Brian Hughes made comments earlier that, we need to do some corrections. And I understand he backed off of that. But then since then, the lieutenant governor's made his comments. And I still think that if we could get something through the House, the Senate would accept it.
Yeah, and I mean, and I'll say too is that, doctors aren't lawyers, but the way that law is initially designed makes it really hard for them to interpret this. And so we got to do everything that we can to clarify the law so we can keep women safe. And that's something that Republicans, Democrats, Independents, everybody wants to keep women safe. I want to believe that these folks mean it when they say that they want to help clarify the law. These are very powerful people. So the longer that we wait and keep these bills, in calendars where they're stuck, the easier it's going to be for these really influential people to do harm to people in Texas. So, we gotta be really urgent about this.
And one thing I want to kind of point out, like, watching the legislature for as long as I've been watching, each legislative session is a little bit different. When we're this close to when the statewide elected officials are up for reelection, the governor's race and the lieutenant governor's race and the attorney general's race, all those are coming up in this next cycle. This next primary is the beginning of that. And as people are thinking about what they want to run for higher offices, particularly, you have a lot more politics potentially that can get into decision making. When you were talking about Brian Hughes, like there's a person, if he decided he wanted to run for a statewide office, like an attorney general spot or something like that, you start having to make that calculation of what can I do with this abortion law that won't become a primary issue? Because as you all know, in elections, everything that's said during a campaign is not always true, right? Attacks are made all the time. This guy's weak on this, or this guy's, weak on that. It's like, and sometimes, that, and so often in these sessions, there's a different kind of political undertone than the years in which the governor's not up for reelection right afterwards. And so watch that kind of going forward. I want to also get into something really super important to, I think, everybody's pocketbook. Property taxes. This is something that the legislature says they're going to try again to get some property tax cuts to Texas, right? They, 2 years ago, we had this historic property tax reduction that was an 18 billion? And the principal key to that was at least this came from the Senate, at least they raised the homestead exemption, which at one point was $40,000 for schools, and now have raised it up to $100,000. Dan Patrick this time around has proposed pushing it up to 140,000. Senator Paul Betancourt, a Republican from Houston, just passed that legislation out of the Senate, and now it's up to the House what they're going to do. The House is doesn't have that same focus on a homestead exemption that the Senate does so far. They want to try to do something that's a little bit broader and help some other businesses as well. The one thing I always know about any sort of tax when you're dealing with property taxes, if you reduce property taxes for some people, it increases the burden elsewhere in the system unless you start cutting like crazy. And so I wanted to start off with you, Representative Allison. Like we obviously have a lot of attempts to reduce property taxes so far. And, we were talking about before we came on, like I have one friend in Houston who 2 years after all these tax cuts, his tax bill went down by $1. And so he isn't quite feeling that tax increase. Is there room in the legislature to do another tax bill, and will it be something that people can feel?
Well, I think there's room to near that another tax bill. The problem that I see, and I think is pretty evident, is the increasing appraisals. That's certainly going to impact increasing the homestead exemption, which sounds great and does provide theoretically some immediate relief. But I'm afraid that it's short-lived, like we're seeing. As the values go up, that value of that homestead exemption decreases. Plus, it's so limited. You have to be a homeowner.
Yeah.
So it doesn't affect the entire populace. The House version, which the governor requested for one of the special sessions, and where the House and Senate got at odds, was compression, to compress the school district rate. That would be a broader relief. But again, it's got a sustainability issue to it. And I know there's claims that, that's where money went into education. Well, it really didn't, not any new money, because the compression money provided for the state would reimburse the school districts for what they lost due to that compression. So there was no new money, it just shifted it. But that seems to be the focus of the House bill, as I understand it, more compression, and also. So I think there'd be a broader application, but
which explains to you why we had special sessions about property taxes 2 years ago, right? Like, while everybody says they want to cut taxes, philosophically, how you want to do it becomes such a big deal that the House and the Senate, their negotiations collapsed just among the Republicans, mind you, where like they had to have 2 special sessions in order to ultimately get to the final number that did get approved. And so we go into this next session with again, some of those same dynamics are starting to flare up again. I know there's people I've spoken to in the House who are like, boy, $140,000 homestead exemption sounds good on paper, but it continues to throw off the balance of our property taxes, right? Which then raises the question of what about everybody else?
Yeah, what
It's
about
like,
us?
and I was going to ask you about that because, like, look, it's like there's a lot of people who like are renters. There are a lot of people who are business owners who aren't feeling the property tax cut. Obviously, if it's only for homesteaded properties, like, is this really the way to get property or get tax relief to the vast majority of Texans?
Well, I mean, if you look at Bear County, 50% of Bear County are renters. I'm a renter. I think it's 4.2 million households are renters here in Texas. Um, Unlike other states, Texas does not give direct relief to renters for any kind of tax breaks. And for both the House and Senate proposals, neither of them are providing that tax relief for renters. So, what I would like to see are some guarantees. Because right now there's no commitments that when a landlord, a property tax or property owner gets this homestead exemption, gets a tax break, that's going to go all the way towards the renter, right? So it's fundamentally unfair. What I think we could do for renters is, maybe it's a $1,000 rebate, $5,000 rebate. I mean, can we put together a subcommittee to talk through, some guarantees for renters? I mean, I'm sure that there's some models across the country that we can do. I mean, because right now, if you just look at it, there are no guarantees for renters, and it's just not fair for us.
Well, one of the things, like, if you might remember this from a couple of years ago, I had an interview with Greg Abbott, and he said he supported maybe reducing the sales tax. At that time when Senator Royce West had a bill to that level, and right after that interview with him, Paul Betancourt and Royce West told me that was news to them that the governor supported the idea, so they started working on the bill, but it clearly didn't go anywhere, and it ultimately did fail to get much further than just that discussion phase. So we'll see where that goes. But one of the things I want to do, I want to kind of get into some of these questions that I'm getting online. So I'm going to throw some questions at us and we kind of dig through them. One of the questions comes from Janet Miller, who was asking about going back to school choice issues and school vouchers, about private school testing and the requirements and like what kind of accountability. And let's talk about that a little bit. It's like, in the legislation we've had in previous years, like what is there any requirement that private schools are going to have to do the same levels of testing that public schools have?
Well, there's a provision that the private schools accepting a voucher will have to provide a norm reference test, but very open of what that would be, and not up to necessarily the requirement that the public schools have of the controversial STAR test. So that's definitely an issue. I think that's one of the major concerns going in, just the transparency and the equal treatment, public schools versus private schools, that it's not a level playing field. It's not fair. One, just the application of the test, taking it, but then what do you do with it?
Yeah.
In the public schools, the STAR test has become the pick for winners and losers, for the teacher success, campus success,
Right.
school district success. Do we see that in the private schools? No. There's no chartering of their test requirement, even as they exist. I understand that the Private School Association, as part of their accreditation process, requires some sort of test.
Yeah.
But providing the test is one thing. How do you use it? And are they going to use it the same way that the public schools use it? I think it's very important.
And what public access to information will you
Right.
have, right? Because like
Right.
in a public school, I can compare, schools on the north side versus Northeast Independent School District, or in, San Antonio, but I can compare that. I don't know how to judge whether or not is this private school as good as this other one, or how do I get more information on it? The Houston Chronicle just had a really good story about just kind of how, private schools don't have, that same, they don't have to put out as nearly as much information for the public on that. And they're right. Obviously they're private schools, right? But it does hinder the parents' ability to kind of pick, what schools they're going to go to.
It
Yeah.
does.
I mean, and I'll say with this, for private schools, they what's frustrating, and I think what feels really unfair is that these are public dollars, these are our tax dollars, and they're going to private schools who don't have to make any of their financial statements public. The business of the private schools is going to remain private, right? What we need, if these are going to be our public dollars, what we need is a measure of transparency and fairness, and we're not going to see any of that.
Yeah, one of the things about private schools that, like, one of the speeches that Governor Abbott gave on his tour was at trying to remember the school I was at right now. I think it was Cypress Christian near Houston.
Mm.
In that school, like, he gave the speech, but one of the problems with that school particularly is that they can pick and choose who's coming to that school. It's like, if you're not, if you don't sign a doctrine saying that you're a Christian, you're not going to be into that school. It's like they can deny you. And so one of the important parts to know about the, private schools, and I talked to Senator Creighton about this, private schools don't have to be part of this. If they don't want to take children who have ESAs, they can do that. And so you see that, like, there is, like you were talking about earlier, the choice part of this conversation can sometimes be the private school that can decide, like, little Johnny's not coming in here because you don't fit our boxes of what we want at this school right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you get into special education, the private schools are not required to provide it.
Mhm.
In fact, the parents lose the federal protections if they go to the private school.
That's right.
And those programs are so expensive, as we're seeing in the public school setting. And some of them, there's some very acute needs of children being addressed for special education needs in the public schools. The private schools just won't do it, can't do it. And that's an important distinction, I think, particularly when they're trying to be the emphasis on addressing those children that have special needs or special education or disabilities. On the testing requirements, there is a provision in the bill that in both the House and the Senate bill, I believe, that the test results are to be provided to one of these 5 entities that are set up under the program. So it's kind of an open question, I guess, but that gets into the public sector if there will be access to those test results, which I don't think the private schools are going to like. But there's 5 entities, each take a piece of the voucher funds, the $1 billion. The 5 entities get 3%, 5%, and the comptroller gets 3%. That's what's so frustrating about this. Over the next 5 years, the projections are that the vouchers will receive $11 billion.
Wow.
$11 billion.
Are we going to have money for anything else?
Starting with $1 billion and then increases up to, by 2030, they show that it's going to be up to 4.8 billion. So for those 5 years, $11 billion. Think what good that could do in the public schools in total or elsewhere. We've got water needs, we've got property taxes, we've got health care, we've got mental health. It'd be much better used than the small percentage of students that may take the vouchers. And then it's complicated, even further compounded, if the rest of the country is correct, and I think we've got to assume that they are, that the vast majority of those kids are already in private schools. So what have we accomplished?
Well, I get a question here about, the issue of DEI. Diversity, equity, inclusion programs clearly have been a topic in the Texas legislature. We saw that a couple of years ago, there was an emphasis to try to end DEI programs at, the college level. The argument that Governor Abbott had made at the time was that, while, some of these programs may have been started off, with good intentions, they have morphed into being too discriminatory about who they're hiring. I want to, ask you all about this issue. I've spoken to Senator, Brendan Creighton. He talked about this issue with me. Like, there's an idea to spread this, anti-DEI message into the public schools in the grade school levels, and they're afraid that people are being hired, because of DEI issues are related. Let's take a step back and, like, would you be surprised if there's more DEI legislation coming out of this Texas legislation, or do you think they've gone as far as they can? Is there stuff for people to be worried about, that there are more programs yet to be cut?
That's certainly the statements coming out of, at least out of the Senate, and I think somewhat out of the governor, that they want to apply DEI restrictions to the public schools. I don't see that. I don't see it. It just doesn't seem to fit in the public schools. And I mean, we have enough trouble right now hiring teachers.
Yep.
And having certified teachers to add another issue like this, it doesn't make any sense to me. I just don't see it applying. I can see the argument in higher education that they was creating different departments and we were getting maybe away from, arguably, away from quality. I just don't see that applying in the public schools. I just don't see it.
Well, you heard it on the campaign trail, right? It's like, a lot of Republicans use this messaging to say, look, Democrats are going too far on this stuff. It's like we got to rein in DEI and like make it about all these other issues. Did you hear that? Were regular voters concerned about that when you were out there?
I know, like I said, I knocked 10,000 doors. Not once did I have anybody mention anything close to this. I mean, people care about how are they going to get their kids to college. I mean, they're talking about the price of eggs. No one's talking about DI. Give me a break.
So I'm just going through more of these questions. If you have a question, even if it's not on any of these topics we've already talked about, certainly throw them into the Q&A and, we'll get into them. And one of the things like did want to bring up, I had one question here about the issue of gambling. It's good because I just wrote about this not too long ago. The governor has opened the door in an interview that I had with him at that governor's mansion. He did tell me that he was open to the idea of maybe doing online sports betting, which is being done in about 39 other states right now, maybe 40. But Texas still doesn't allow it to happen. But of course, the Texas Constitution says you can't expand gaming in Texas. So we kind of have this confluence on this issue. Is this the year that the Texas legislature does anything with gaming, you think?
I think there's an effort to do it. I know there's a big push from Texas Sands to do it. What I think is being missed is it has to go out for a vote, for a public vote.
Good point.
Yeah, that's right.
And how can you oppose putting something out for a public vote? And I don't want to beat the voucher thing to death, but why don't we put the voucher issue out for a vote?
That's right.
And see, we're going to put the gambling thing out for a vote if it passes. I think we came up one vote short last session.
Yep.
To do it. How can you say, no, I know better than you, voter? How can a member of the legislature say, no, I know better, you don't need to vote on this? That troubles me.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think we should put this to a vote. I mean, and if other states are taking advantage of this, I mean, it's a national trend. Why can't Texas get in on this? When I've heard Republicans talk about, this issue, you hear a lot of people, they're always talking about like, economic development. This is good for economic development. For me, I kind of want to go even further than that, right? Further than job creation. I want to know, how does this impact the community, right? Are there going to be commitments that Texans, people from Texas, are going to get jobs that are beyond, the cooks and the maids in the hotel rooms and the midnight vacuum cleaners, right? Like what Texans need are higher than minimum wage jobs that come with benefits. So I think a lot of voters want to understand that too. So I think that a lot of those questions need to get answers before folks feel comfortable enough to vote for it.
Yeah, and one thing, there's a casino gaming bill that Representative Senator Carol Alvarado has that would also allow casinos and online sports betting. San Antonio would get a casino out of that. There would be 2 in Houston, 2 in Dallas. And again, we saw that there's some support out there. And remember, and you mentioned the Las Vegas Sands. So, 2 of the biggest campaign donors over this last couple of cycles has been Miriam Adelson, who is Las Vegas Sands, and Tillman Fertitta, who is, he's a Houston, billionaire, but he has the Golden Nugget as part of his portfolio. You see big donors are giving a lot of money to a lot of people in the state government to try to get Texas to expand gaming. Because as we know, it's like people are still gambling, right? We know if you ever, like a friend of mine said, if you ever go to the casinos in Las Vegas, they're all Texas plates in the parking lot. You go up to Oklahoma, it's all Texas plates. They know what they're doing in that regard. And the one thing I'll be interesting to see is like there've been all these complications with the lottery of late. Eric Dexheimer at the Houston Chronicle has done amazing work on showing how they've been using these courier services to game the system a little bit to kind of help improve the odds of certain people winning it. that has made Dan Patrick very concerned. And like you've seen him do, I don't know if y'all saw, he did like a 60 minutes type interview of his own, where he went to one of these places that are doing that kind of work, where they'd given out a $83 million payout. And so questions about the lottery system, which is a form of legalized gambling, questions about that could quickly combine into this discussion on, casinos and sports betting, whether or not we even get there.
Well, and I think there's been increased interest driven by the format of the casinos or resorts, whatever. And I think the governor's even supported that, saying that he could possibly get behind something that's more of a resort, family-oriented type setting, as opposed to just pure gambling casinos, Las Vegas style. I think the WinStar in Oklahoma shows that. I think there's a lot of people that want the entertainment aspect of it. And I know there's a lot of pushback. Well, it's going to bring crime and it's going to bring an unsavory element. I think that could be controlled and could be. And it's just a job creator. It's a revenue source that we're going to have to start looking for.
Yeah, when I had one question from somebody here about how, like, it wasn't the lottery created to help provide education funding? And it's like, and you've probably heard this discussion, more than most of us. It's like you've heard this in the legislature before. It's like, shouldn't schools be getting more money out of the lottery system?
Well, it was supposedly devoted to education. I haven't seen that happen.
Yeah,
I think it did in the early stages, some trickle, then it went to the general fund, and I don't know where it goes now.
Yeah, I remember,
It's certainly not coming to education.
yeah, I think I remember at some point it's like if you took all that money from the lottery, you might be able to fund the schools for like, 2 days or 3 days of, educational work, but there's a
Right.
lot more go on that. Let's see what just trying to see what other questions we have. Focus on water issues. Oh boy, that's a tough one, right? So we're getting into an expertise that I'm not great at, but one of the issues that Governor Abbott has made one of his priority items is to try to, move water from East Texas to West Texas. It sounds crazy on a level, right? It's like, and I'm not sure how you kind of quite do it. I don't know if you get oil pipelines that can be reversed going out west, but that's one of the issues that's a big ticket item though, when you start talking about water resources. Every time they kind of dabble onto this issue, you have places that have too much water, like East Texas, and places that don't have enough water, and how they spread it all out. It's like, is this you've heard these bills go through before, or at least get worked on? This is a big price tag, right?
It's a big price tag, but it's a huge need. And an increasing one. Yeah, we're growing fast, an influx of people and businesses, and a shortage of water. So we've got to deal with that. I know Senator Perry has a very comprehensive bill going forward this session. He did a lot of work last session. We passed a bill that provided $1 billion, which sounds like a lot, but it was a drop in the bucket. Had to use that for water, but it was primarily designed to for maintenance of aged remote rural systems. That wasn't going to accomplish that at all. So we need something far more comprehensive and a lasting fund, because we're running out of water.
I have a question that's perfect for you here. It's like, what are Texas Democrats supposed to do at this point? How do we regroup and, tackle the Texas legislature? I know a lot of people coming out of this election going like, there's a lot of losses out there. And it's like, but how do you, like, what happens here? What can people do at this point to stay engaged and start having some influence? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, I last year, November, it was a really hard night for Democrats everywhere, right? But I think that the state party here in Texas and Democrats across the state are trying to figure out, how do they rebuild for next cycle? Certainly, we are 14 seats down in the state house. And so there's conversations about what is the strategy to win back those house seats and do that before the next redistricting. So that way, because I think Texas is supposed to get, 4 to 5 more congressional seats because of all the people that are coming here to Texas. So there's a lot of strategy, a lot of conversations around that. We saw, and I'm going to talk about, my district 118, we saw a lot of what's already been happening down in South Texas, where Democrats have been losing Hispanic working class voters. So I think that that's going to be a priority for us, is making sure that we're engaging with Hispanic working class people and meeting them where they're at. real organizing, and that's gonna come with investments. So we gotta make sure that we're doing everything we can to fundraise, and do that. And, we gotta make sure that we're targeting these competitive districts, 118 and 121, the state party certainly has their eye on, and they wanna make sure that they're finding really strong candidates to recruit for that. So it's gonna take, making sure that there's an economic message when you're talking to working class Hispanic people, because I think we often forget that a lot of these issues that we talk about, there is an economic component. An example of that is you talk about border security. We can't lose sight that when we're talking about, the border, that we're also talking about jobs, right? So, I mean, the border employs a lot of jobs for a lot of those communities. So we got to make sure that we're having these conversations the right way. We're identifying really good candidates to run in these seats, and we got to do that quickly.
And just to dovetail on what you were saying, so what typically happens at the end of a decade is that races in Texas get a lot more competitive as the redistricting kind of wears off. As you look at 2018, right before in that cycle, we ended up having 12 House seats flipped from Republican to Democrat. We had 2 Texas Senate seats flip over, and we had 2 congressional seats. But you saw with the redistricting, in this last cycle, it's like it's still kind of strong, right? It's hard for like seats to kind of flip over right now. But as we talk about like, well, how do Democrats get back in winning some seats to make it closer? Well, that's going to take some time. And as the population of Texas shifts and becomes more urban, and like there's a lot of things that are happening demographically to the state that can assist Democrats in winning seats in the legislature. Again, we saw it in 2018. The question of can they make those changes ahead of time? And I did talk to the Democratic National Committee chairman, the new guy, Martin,
Mhm.
and he told me in my interview with him, without me even bringing it up, he said we need to win 14 seats in the Texas
There-
House, right? So to have somebody from Minnesota at the Democratic National Committee even understanding how important Texas is to the overall Democratic strategy tells me they at least now know a little bit more and are saying the right words to kind of get in part of the game. Whether or not that transpires into real help on the ground is another story, but at least they're talking about it, right? Um, and I think we got time for one more question here. Let's talk about the vaccine issue. One of the things that's happening, out there right now, like there was an anti-vaccine push coming out of the pandemic, of course. But now we're having these stories about this measles outbreak, a very contagious disease. And like I saw something today where like once you start getting under 95% coverage on a vaccination, you start losing herd immunity. And that's kind of concerning. Is this an area where the Texas legislature has any room to kind of, work on this issue? Is there any place to go to make sure that more vaccines are being done, or is it just up to the populace at this point?
Well, it's scary right now, in my view. I think there's a segment that want no vaccines, or free choice to accept the vaccine or not, which I can understand with the controversy over the COVID vaccine that wasn't fully tested and all, but when you deal with the measles vaccine, that's pretty well established
Mhm.
that it works. And we've required of our school children, obviously for obvious reasons, that they have to have the measles, mumps, rubella. Uh, how can you oppose vaccines like that for the public good? And we're seeing it with the measles epidemic. I
Yeah.
mean, that is growing like wildfire already, and it's concerning.
Yeah.
Uh, it spread into. I mean, there were reports it spread into San Antonio and to San
Mhm.
Marcos when those people travel, and there's a death now yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, a child in Lubbock. I think as of yesterday, there's been 127 confirmed cases in
Yeah.
Texas, 18 hospitalizations. I haven't seen, I mean, and maybe this just happened today, but I haven't seen if Governor Abbott has like put out a PSA on this. And the part of it that's really troubling, because it's not just children that are not vaxxed, it's also elderly people, 70, and 90 plus, who maybe got the MMR vaccine when they were much younger, but because we eradicated measles in 2000, nobody had made sure that these folks are getting that shot again. So I mean, it's worn off on a lot of these elderly folks. And San Antonio, we have a lot of elderly people, a lot of elderly people with that are medically fragile. They have diabetes, a lot of elderly veterans, people that are immunocompromised. These folks definitely need to get the MMR booster. I'm like driving down, when I was like driving down here from the south side or driving up Flores, and I'm like seeing the pharmacies. It's like measles booster available. It's like all the signs are popping up. So I say, like, if you know somebody or yourself, and if you're elderly, you're over 70, if you got the MMR shot prior to 1968, you need to get it again.
Yep. Well, look, I can't thank y'all enough for joining me on this. Like, I hope y'all get something out of this as we kind of go forward in the legislative session. It's only 140 days, and like we're already, over a month into this. And so a lot's going to start happening real quick on all these issues we talked about. It's like you'll definitely want to stay in touch with the Houston Chronicle and the Express News and follow our coverage there. Please check out the Texas Take newsletter. I break down all this stuff every day. And of course, check out the Texas Take podcast with me and Scott Braddock. We're talking about all these issues throughout the session. We were doing some pretty deep dives on the school choice, school voucher issue. No matter what you want to call it, we're going to tackle it. But thanks a lot to both of y'all for joining me on this. And I appreciate it. And I hope y'all enjoyed the program. And we'll be doing this again soon. So thanks a lot.